as well. So enjoy yourself. Have a great week. Those of you who are not from here or are visiting, we're going through the Bible verse by verse. We're in the book of John, and we're going to continue in the book of John, John chapter 18. And so a little background. What has happened so far is Jesus finishes giving his last instructions to his closest disciples. Pray in the garden. He's been arrested. What has happened in this story the evening before, it's morning at this point, early in the morning. And at this point in the story, Jesus has just gone through a mistrial, I guess you could say, an illegal trial, better worded. He's gone before the Jewish high priests, Caiaphas and Annas. They're giving him a trial. And one of the reasons, many reasons why it's an illegal trial is they bribed Judas to betray him. But there's other reasons. In Jewish jurisprudence, there's a tongue twister, you could not have a trial after the evening sacrifices prior to the morning sacrifices, nor for capital cases could you bring a position of condemnation. Hey, you're going to the cross, you're going to get stoned, whatever the capital punishment was. You could not do it on the day before a holiday, a holy day, and really is what it is, Passover in this case. So the Passover is about to happen. The high priests want to get rid of Jesus, this problem who's a challenge to their authority. They want to do it quickly, and they want to keep their hands clean. So we pick up the story in John chapter 18, verse 28. Then the Jews, when he says the Jews, he means the Jewish leadership, led Jesus from Caiaphas, the high priest, to the palace of the Roman governor. It's called the Praetorium. See, the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, as we all know, had two places that he would stay at, Caesarea on the west coast, on the Mediterranean, and he would live there. But then he also would stay in a place called the Praetorium, his palace in the city, and he would show up with a big regiment, in particular during the holy days, the Passover and the different times of year, the Feast of Trumpets, and he would show up because that's when the general unrest would happen. He would show up with a big military contingent. I'm Rome, tote the line, don't cause any problems. So he shows up, stays there, and they take advantage of him being in town. By now, it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. Now, according to God's law, the Old Testament, applicable to the Jews of the Old Testament, there was a rule that to go into and participate in an event like the Passover, which signifies them being pulled out of slavery, God taking them into the promised land, the beginning of that. They slain, a lamb was slain, a spotless lamb was slain. They applied the blood. The modern representation, of course, is Jesus, our lamb, was slain on our behalf. And so there is a temporary sacrifice, but in order to participate in this, what had to happen is you had to be purified, you had to be clean. And that meant you shouldn't touch any unclean thing. This was law. And so what they would do in the week before, they would search out leaven in their house, anything yeast-like, and they would make sure it's all out of their house. Let's eat unleavened bread, the matzah bread, things like that before, because yeast signified sin. So it was a symbolic action that they would do to make sure that they were clean. You couldn't touch a dead person or a tomb because that would make you unclean. Now, that was God's law. What they did is they added law upon law in tradition. So the tradition was you couldn't go inside a Gentile's house. This was all kind of backwards. This was never God's intention. His intention all along is, I have chosen you, people of Israel, to be my representatives as an instrument to reach the Gentiles, all nations. You see it throughout the book of Isaiah, Psalms. You see it pictured in the book of Jonah. And they turned inward. You're my God. I don't want anything to do with those pagans. In fact, at this time that this is being written, there was a tradition that you and I, most of us with non-Jewish roots, you and I were fodder for the fuels of hell. In other words, you were firewood. Why would I spend time with you, going into your house, witnessing to you, sharing, if all you are good for is to keep a fire burning hot? Obviously, not God's heart. So this is kind of the intention, and the interesting and ironic thing is that here they go, they're like, look, we want to stay pure for the sacrifice, so I'm not going to do this little thing like go into your house, this tradition I added. Ironic, because they just finished spending the night doing multiple things and breaking God's law in pretty big ways. One, a legal trial. doing it through manipulation, doing it through drumming up false witnesses and people who are willing to stretch the truth. But here's the big one. Kind of important, that thing called the Ten Commandments. The murdering part, the plotting and manipulating to murder, and yet you think it's okay not to go into a Gentile's home. Do you see the irony in these guys who are so messed up? They're hypocrites. In fact, Jesus says something to them a couple weeks beforehand. He yells at these, he really gives them a hard time. He says, look, you guys, you strain a gnat out and you swallow a camel. And of course, he's the master of hyperbole and irony. He's like, look at these little tiny things, which really is no big deal to swallow a gnat. It's the smallest of all the little flies. And yet you swallow a giant camel. I mean, do you see the irony in all that? That's what you're doing, spiritually speaking. And he tells them this over and over and really has the harshest words of rebuke for them. Now, it was an illegal trial, but it was also, they changed the sentencing. They hated the fact that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, God himself. Look, they didn't even consider whether it was true or not because he upset the balance of power. They're powerful, and they don't want this competing guy there. But of course, that doesn't pull any weight with the Romans, so they got to change it. Well, the Romans won't care if he says that he's God himself because really the Romans believe in a pantheon of gods and really no big a deal. So we got to do something that really gets their interest. And the number one thing, see, the Romans didn't care what you believed. All they cared about is you paid your taxes and you toted the line. What they did care about is rebellion and people that were changing the status quo. So they're thinking, going, how can I manipulate? You know what? How can we make the Romans do this to keep our hands clean? Let's say this guy says he's a spiritual king. Let's say he's a king and he's competing with Caesar. Now that will get their attention. And so they do all this kind of crazy stuff of inventing charges. Now, verse 29, so Pilate came out to them and asked, what charges are you bringing against this man? Hey, it's a logical question. Verse 30, if he were not a criminal, they replied, we would not have handed him over to you. What you have to understand, I think, that perhaps Pilate normally wouldn't entertain an accusation in this way, and on this date right before this, hey, take it through the court system. Let's deal with it properly. But if you remember from last week, he had this uneasy alliance with the religious leaderships. Why this is important? Because in Israel of this time, you could not separate politics from religion. They were completely intertwined. It was all part, you see throughout the Old Testament, the idea that this is part of our culture and it's intertwined. And so here you've got this guy who realizes these are unlike other people groups. We control the destiny of all these different countries, ethnic groups, but these guys are different. They really take their faith seriously. And so I have to forge an alliance with the religious leaders to make sure that it keeps the peace. Rome understood this. So they get into bed, I guess you could say, with the religious elite. 30 years prior to this event, they had appointed Caiaphas, his father-in-law. Caiaphas was the high priest. So they appoint this guy named Annas. Annas was the first high priest that the Romans put into power. They put him into power for a specific reason. They didn't want a regular high priest to be in control because that guy's going to listen to what God has to say and what the Word of God has to say. But if we take a greedy guy like Annas, we know what motivates him: money and power. And we can control that. So they put Annas in power. In fact, a few years later, if you remember from last week, they actually took him out of power because he tried to kill all his competitors. You know, if he was really kind of bloodthirsty. They're like, oh, that's a little too much. But this time he had so much power. So what they did is, this is part of the dynasty of Annas. They put 4 of his sons sequentially into a high priest into the position. So for years and years, the puppet master was Annas. At this point, Caiaphas, his son-in-law, is the high priest. He's the guy that really controls what goes on in the background in politics and religion in that area. So here is the problem. Rome needs to have status quo and peace, and they need to have their man in power. So here's Annas. And so Pilate, to a degree, really has to pander to the religious leaders. Verse 31, Pilate said, take him yourself and judge him by your own law. But we have no right to execute him. Anyone, the Jews objected. That right was taken years away when the Romans came into power. Rome had to execute. Verse 32, this happened so that the words Jesus had spoken indicating the kind of death he was going to die would be fulfilled. Here's the deal. Pilate's not an idiot. He's not fooled. He recognizes that Jesus wasn't really doing anyone harm, but he was turning the tables on Annas. In fact, Matthew 27, the account of this whole story tells us that Pilate perceived that it was out of self-interest that they handed Jesus over to the Romans. And Jesus does something else. He also foretells, and he says that he will be lifted up. That was a euphemism of the day to being lifted up on a cross. He prophesied the way he would be killed, that he would be murdered. It was going to be on a cross. And so this had to happen this way because it was prophesied. But if the Jews did their form of capital punishment and Pilate allowed them to, they would kill him by stoning. Instead, it was on the cross that Jesus was destined to. Verse 33, Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, all right, they're telling you the king, you're the Jew, you say you're a king. Are you really the king of the Jews? I mean, he doesn't believe it, but... And so Jesus kindly responds, is that your own idea? Or did others talk to you about me? Jesus is always willing to go to the heart of the issue. Hey, look, Pilate, I'm willing to talk to you about truth if you're willing to listen. Hey, is that your idea? Let's talk about it. Who do you say I am? Is what Jesus asked other people. It's the same kind of idea. Verse 35. Am I a Jew? Pilate replied. It was your people and your chief priests who handed you over to me. Let's just get down to it. What is it that you've done? He's not in the mood. Verse 36, Jesus said, I'm going to straighten this out. My kingdom is not of this world. You're worried about a political opponent. I'm not that. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews. But now my kingdom is from another place. So you don't have to worry. Yeah, I'm not in competition with Rome. I have a totally, completely different kingdom. Verse 37, you are a king then, said Pilate. And Jesus answered, you're right in saying I'm a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. Let me repeat that because this is really profound. You want to know the purpose that someone has? Well, Jesus clearly knew his purpose, and here it is. You're right in saying I'm a king. I'm a king. I'm a king. That's who I am. In fact, for this reason I was born to be a king, and for this I came into the world to testify to the truth. I'm a king, and my purpose was to bring the truth. And here's the deal. If you're on the side of truth, you're going to listen. In God's sovereignty, he set this up that on December 24th, Christmas Eve, we'd be at this point in the message. For this reason, Jesus was born. Do not miss the story and the application that God has for us this morning is to recognize that Jesus, yes, is a king, but he has a purpose, that you and I would know the truth. He tells us earlier that the truth will set you free. But here's the deal. If you don't listen, you don't understand the truth. We're going to come back to this in a little while. Pilate responds. He'd be a great postmodernist. I can imagine him sighing, what is truth? Talk about truth. What is it? Man, I don't know. Pilate asked. With this, he went out again to the Jews and said, I find no basis for a charge against this man. A typical secular view says that truth is not objective, that everything is subject to your own thinking. Morality, laws are all relative to an individual, their preference, and their preferences. Here is Pilate. He's standing in front of the embodiment of truth itself. This would be a great time to start asking some questions. Really? Your purpose is truth? Man, I have no idea what truth is. Let's talk about it. At least be willing to listen, whether he acknowledges the result of it. But you know what he does? And don't miss this. He turns around and he says, what is truth? And he walks away. Truth itself is in front of him. And in a very real way, you and I, we got the same truth embodied in front of us in the gospel, in the Word of God sitting in our hand. And you know what we do? In our culture in particular now, and it's the same packaged, repackaged over and over throughout history. The enemy's goal, of course, is, look, there can't be a standard of truth, because if there's a truth that doesn't change, whether you were born in the Congo or in Clearwater, if it doesn't change, it's applicable to every color and race and language. Here it is in concrete form. I have to undermine that. And I'll do whatever it takes, is what the enemy says, to undermine that, because I can't have people grabbing a hold of truth that will change their lives. And so he masquerades and he fools people into thinking that truth is not knowable. If you're of the truth, you'll listen to what I have to say. He doesn't wait for the answer. And Jesus just finished saying two things. One, here's my purpose. It's to bear witness to the truth. And two, if you're of the truth, you'd listen. Verse 39, he continues, and we'll come back to this, but it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the King of the Jews? He knows that Jesus is not guilty, so what does he do? He's like, look, I'm being manipulated, I get it. But I'm going to offer a political way to save face. Here you have the custom of releasing a prisoner, so I'm going to give you a choice. A murdering thief convicted in a rebellion that no one wants to release, no logical person would want on the streets, and the peaceful, loving, giving Jesus. It seems pretty obvious who you're going to choose, yet they don't. Verse 40, they shouted back, no, not him, give us Barabbas. Now, Barabbas had taken part in a rebellion. This is amazing. They cry out for the release of Barabbas. Now, in the other gospel accounts of the same story, John is glossing over some of these things because he has a different purpose for writing and accounting of the story. But he glosses over the other gospel accounts. They say that Barabbas was a thief, a murderer, caught in a rebellion. Some translations say he was a brigand. But here's the deal. The other gospel accounts say that there was a crowd that had formed. The Greek word for crowd is a different one that's used for a multitude. And a lot of scholars believe that there was only a couple dozen people present. These are Caiaphas's henchmen. They're his police force, the other priests, the people that he controls. This is a great political move. Has a trial, an illegal trial at night, found guilty of blasphemy, given over. I've got to get him dealt with so we can get on with the Passover weekend and deal with these things. And so the masses are still in bed. They're not turning on Jesus. These are the people that he manipulates. A political move by Caiaphas to deal with the threat of Jesus quickly before the sacrifice. A few more verses in 19 that we're going to continue this story. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns, put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him in the face. Once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." So he takes a different tactic. I'm going to flog him, humiliate him. Maybe I could get out of this sticky wicket, this sticky situation, by appeasing the crowd. Hey, I'll beat them. Maybe they'll say that's good enough. And they don't. In verse 6, as soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify!" But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. For as for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." They're the big voices, the leadership. Verse 7, the Jews insisted, "We have a law. And according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God," the real reason that he's really there. Oh, okay. This is why he's there. But then Pilate, who, by the way, almost all Romans, but him in particular, was a superstitious man, believed in a pantheon of different gods. When he heard this, he was even more afraid. He already knows there's something different about this guy, just the way he's reacting. He's fearless. He speaks with authority. He's the Son of God. I don't know what this means, but that doesn't look well for me. And he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus, but Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" And probably no one in his entire career has ever gone back with and spoke to him with such authority in this circumstance. And Jesus answered, "You'd have no power over me if it were not given to you from above." Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. In Matthew's account of these same events that are happening, Pilate's wife, she warns him because of a dream to have nothing to do with this innocent man. Look, I've suffered greatly. Pilate, husband, have nothing to do with him. Let him go. And now he finds out he is accused of being the Son of God. Oh, I better do something. I better release this guy. And what happens? Verse 12 to 16. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jews kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you're no friend of Caesar. And anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." Uh-oh, we've got you in an armbar, Pilate. What can you do about this? When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the stone pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of Passover week, about the 6th hour. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews, but they shouted, take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. They come in again with this clincher. "This is the way we've got you, Pilate." Because the number one sin that the Roman leadership took into consideration was rebellion, political opposition. Again, they don't care what religion you have. They took political threats seriously. A zero tolerance, I guess you could say. So Pilate's manipulated into giving them what they want. I find this very interesting. Here they say, "We have no king but Caesar." It's ironic, but it's also hypocritical. Why? Because in Matthew 22, the high priests, they send their scribes, their experts in the law. They go, "Okay, let's go try to trap him up. We've got to put an end to this guy. He's dangerous. How can we do that? Well, we got to discredit him. How are we going to do that? Go to him with a Roman coin and say, 'Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar?' And if he says no, then you're going to upset the Herodians." The Herodians were Jews who supported King Herod, who was a pawn, of course, of Rome, and he pandered to Rome to stay in power. And the Herodians supported him. If Jesus said, "No, you can't," they're going to report him to Rome, and Rome's going to deal with it seriously, and they're going to go, "We've got to deal with this man because that's political treason." Done. Okay, but what if he says yes? Oh, then you're in trouble with the masses. The masses hated Rome, this foreign occupier. He would have lost all kinds of credibility. And Jesus perceives this. The other reason why it's wrong is because part of the second commandment was to make no graven image. No graven images at all, but in particular of a god. Caesar Tiberius was always considered to be a god, small g. And so he's showing the coin. Here's something that Jews hated. The fact that there were coins with a god in their holy country. This is a clear breaking of the second commandment. If Jesus supported paying taxes, in essence, he's saying, hey, it's okay, use that money. And what does he do? He wisely says, hey, whose face is on that? And they said, Caesar's. Well, give to Caesar. If that's Caesar's, then give to Caesar what's Caesar's. And they're like, wow, okay, that didn't go the way we wanted. But ironically, if Jesus even said, I support Rome in any way, there would have been trouble for Jesus. The masses would have turned on him. And here they go, we have no king but Caesar, the very thing they were accusing Jesus of trying to do, of trying to trip him up. In fact, you go to Israel today and coins don't even have faces on them, they have plants. You know, no graven images of things. And so here I just find it ironic. Again, these people, if Jesus had ever said, we have no king but Caesar, they would have discredited him and made a big deal of it. Bunch of hypocrites. Jesus always had the harshest words for them. So here's Jesus, born to be king, born to bear truth. And he's going to the cross as the high point of all history. You see, tonight we're going to talk about what if Jesus had never been born? But you got the beginning of Genesis 1:2. He created all things perfectly, and then there was the fall. What we have to understand is that there's only 2 chapters that talk about this incredible existence that our forefathers had. And from Genesis 3 on, it all points to this moment in time, the birth and the death of Jesus. Everything in history hinges upon this story right here, and that's what makes it so clearly a Christmas story. So we're done the message. Not done yet, not letting you go. So don't get too excited. We've got application. This is essentially a story of 4 men. Well, really 3 men. The story of Jesus, born to bear truth. And 3 men who have an encounter with Jesus. We want to look at how they have this encounter and what they do in response to an encounter with the embodiment of truth itself. Let's start with Pilate. So here's Pilate. He's powerful. He's privileged. He has everything that the world could offer him. In fact, he married the granddaughter of Tiberius Caesar. Great way to get a political appointment, become your own governor, your little mini king over your realm. Lots of wealth, have everything that you could possibly want. But at this point in our story, what you don't realize is he's on really thin ice as the governor. Here's what happened. He starts his new appointment. Hey, I'm going to send you and my granddaughter. We're going to give you a good position. You're going to go take over this new province. It's called Palestine. It's the area of Judea. These people are a little difficult, but you can handle it. So he sets up his appointment in Caesarea, the capital of that province. And his first journey into Jerusalem, the holy city, what he would typically do, what every Roman governor would do, is he'd show up in force with his army. At the beginning of the soldiers, you would always have what they call a standard bearer. And on this standard bearer, you would have the eagle, of course, which represented the Rome, what legion it was. And then you would have an image of Julius or Tiberius Caesar at this time, the emperor. This is a mistake. All of the previous governors and the people that led over this area for Rome, they realized, look, the Jews don't take lightly to a graven image. It seems to break a law, and they raise a ruckus. So just before they got into Jerusalem, they would take the image off the standard. They would still go in there with the banners and things like that. So here you've got this arrogant dude who comes in and says, hey, I represent Rome. I don't care what you believe, and I'm not even going to take into your consideration this cross-cultural impact. I'm going to rule the way I want to rule because I'm arrogant and I'm Pilate. And so he goes into Jerusalem with the standard on there. Of course, the Jews, they raise a ruckus like they do in these kind of circumstances. And finally, he's like, look, all these people are following me around. I'm out of here. I'm going back to Caesarea. Well, a group of the Jews all followed him. And apparently, historians tell us that they were polite. Hey, please, look, if you come back into the holy city, the thing we're asking you, just take off the graven image. This is a big deal for us. It's not that big of a deal for you. And his arrogance, he said, no way. And they follow him all the way back, which is a big deal in that time, going from Jerusalem to the coast. They get there. He's had enough of them. He rounds them all up, forces them into a stadium and says, look, if you guys don't cut it out, it is what it is. If you don't cut it out, I'm going to kill you all. What do? He did something. They all did something they didn't expect. They stuck their necks out and they pulled their shirts back and says, all right, what are you waiting for? Of course, he stands back and goes, I didn't expect that. Wisely, he says, okay, I'll remove it when I come back into the city. Lets them go. They take off. That's strike one. That's how you start your rule. Already they're going, look, we don't like this new governor. He doesn't respect us. We don't respect their rule. He's got one strike against us. Strike two was he wanted to do something great. Jerusalem is growing in importance. It's a trade. A lot of people are coming through that area from east and west and Africa, coming up into Rome. Lots of trade passes nearby. It's growing. We're running out of water source. Let's build an aqueduct. Good thing, public works. Where am I going to get the money? Oh, the temple seems to have a lot of money. I'm going to take it from the temple. How do you think the Jews like that? Not so much. So he goes and takes the money, starts building his aqueduct. People start to riot. So in his wisdom, he puts on some of his soldiers in plain clothes outfit, starts walking through the crowd, stabbing people. This is not in chapter 2 of How to Win Friends and Influence People. He really needs to take some kind of course. How to Rule Your Province 101. Strike 2. Strike 3. This all happened before this event. Strike 3. He wants to honor his wife's grandfather. And so Tiberius Caesar, he has a bunch of shields made up. And he puts the name of Tiberius Caesar on the shield. And he sets them up in Herod's temple in Jerusalem, where he often would stay as well. in the holy city. The Jews look at this and they go, "What? This is just a bad idea. Come on. Don't bring the name of a god into our city, please." They beg him. He's like, "I'm going to do it. I'm Pilate. I'm the governor." So he does it. So what do? They're like, "Lord, we're done with this guy." We send an email off to Rome. Rome gets it. Tiberius sends him an email and sends him a letter and says, "Hey, don't be a bonehead. Come on, man. You're supposed to be ruling. Use some wisdom." So here he's on thin ice with the emperor himself. Strike three. They want nothing to do with him. And the Jewish leadership knows this. This guy's in trouble. He can do what we want. We can manipulate him. A couple of observations about this man, Pilate, and how he deals with Jesus. I think it's wise for us to take a look at his life. Why? Because he has more in common with us, with you, with man in general, than we realize. First thing we notice about him, and knowing a little bit about the context and the history of him, is his arrogance impacted how he interacts with others. This guy was unwilling to listen to truth. As a result, he was unwilling to accept Jesus' invitation to learn more because of his arrogance. I mean, he asks, "What is truth?" And he doesn't even stick around to find out the answer with truth sitting in front of him. Is that you? Look, if the Holy Spirit's moving in your life because you're open, because of you've got a moment of pride or of humility in your life because the Word of God is speaking to you, the best Christmas gift this season is to receive Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life, as he says in John chapter 14. No one comes to the Father except through him. He is the ultimate and only standard of ultimate truth for eternity. And we have to explore that. To reject him is to choose to govern oneself with a lie. You realize that. If you don't elevate Jesus to a position on your heart, you will elevate something else. And it's a lie. It's not the truth. A couple other things we learn is that Pilate knows naturally. He perceived that they delivered Jesus over for self-interest. So he's using his brains. He sees that this guy's innocent, but he also knows something supernaturally from his wife's dream that Jesus is innocent. There's something special about him. And he wants to release Jesus, so he tries to put the blame on the Jews. In essence, he washes his hands. "I've washed my hands of the blood of this man. You deal with him." There's a problem with that. When we're dealing with Jesus, many of us just simply want to wash our hands, refusing to deal with Jesus, but this doesn't work. Why? Because you cannot individually, personally pass the responsibility to deal with Jesus to someone else. It's something that you and I need to take into consideration. Third thing we learn about him is that he's a politician. So what does he do next in his wisdom? He picks the biggest loser in jail and tries a compromise. Do you want Jesus, the Son of God, or Jesus Barabbas, the criminal? Here's an interesting thing. Jesus, the Son of the capital F, Father, God himself, in exchange for Barabbas, the Hebrew word Barabbas, Bar-Avas. It means son of the Father, small f. Hey, do you want to choose? You have a choice is what he's saying. You have a choice between God, very God in the flesh, the ultimate truth, or the man after the flesh. Jesus, the Son of small f, Father. But what does he do? He tries to push off making a decision regarding Jesus. I'm not going to deal with it. Then he tries to scourge Jesus, whip him, beat him, humiliate him. I'm going to see if that appeases other people. But here's the problem with that, is every person has a personal decision to make regarding Jesus, to accept or reject him. You can't escape the decision. The question here for all of us this morning is, what will I do with Jesus? You can't push it off. We have a personal decision to make. Finally, what Pilate does is he gives in for fear of losing his position. He doesn't have the courage to do what he knows to be right. Here's the application for that. By not dealing with Jesus, what we do is we give in to a default decision. Each of us has a personal decision to make. Not making a decision is a decision. Here's the last thing that we know about Pontius Pilate. He is dead. Ecclesiastes, Solomon in his wisdom, he says something to us. He says, look, I'd rather be in the house of mourning than the house of feasting, for death is the destiny of all men. The living should take it to heart. What he's saying is, look, I'd rather be at a funeral than a wedding. Odd thing to say. Why? Because in the middle of the feasting and the festivities, my mind is on that moment. At a funeral, my mind is brought back to that my life is a vapor. It's a puff. It's a blade of grass that withers. My life is short. Do you realize, statistically speaking, here's a great statistic, 100% of us, if the Lord does not return, will die. Will die, not might, 100%. And what do? We put it off. We put it off. I'll make a decision about Jesus some other time. I'm going to push it off to someone else. That's a decision. It's a default decision. Death is the destiny of all men. A year or so after the death of Jesus, there was a rebellion in Samaria. Fact. Pilate goes in there with his brutal nature. Philo, the Roman historian, tells us that he was very brutal by nature. Brutal man seeking to let Jesus go. He definitely knew Jesus was innocent. And he goes in there with this over force, too much force. And he goes and whoops up that area, kills a ton of people, so much so that the Roman emperor hears about it and says, get back here. You've just lost your job. He heads on his way there. Back, the Roman Caesar Tiberius dies. They don't know what to do with him. Shortly after, Pilate goes and kills himself within that year. He's dead. And he didn't make a decision regarding the truth. The second person we'll look at in the last few minutes that we're here is Caiaphas. Caiaphas, who is he? Well, he's the religious elite. He's the religious hypocrite who knows and obeys the law to the tiniest detail. He willingly plots murder, but observes the law to the nth degree, even the traditions surrounding the law that really aren't law, by not going into Pilate's home so as not to be defiled. He's rich, he's powerful. Outwardly, he looks really good as a religious adherent. Here's the problem with this guy is he thinks that his actions are what earns his place in heaven. He has zero saving reality to his faith. Jesus, he rebukes the Pharisees and the religious leaders of the day in Mark chapter 7, and he says, all the things that you do, you tithe right down to your spice rack, your mint and your cumin. You're zealous at following the law of God and then the fence laws that you have built around the law to prevent you from building the law. You look really great outwardly, but inwardly you're full of dead man's bones. He says your works are useless. The Greek word, it says your works are vain, but the Greek word means useless. It's of no value of you trying to earn your place in heaven. Here's the other thing we learn about him. Fact. Almost 27 years ago to the day, in 1990, some workers were constructing a water park south of the old city of Jerusalem. They accidentally uncovered a burial cave. In the cave were a dozen limestone chests that contained bones. These are called ossuaries. They were elaborately carved, typically used only in the 1st century AD, typically only used by the wealthy. And one of them had on it carved Joseph, son of Caiaphas, carved on it. Caiaphas was certainly a historical figure. We learn about him from Philo, from Josephus, from the Bible, from archaeological discoveries like this. Here's the deal. He's a pile of bones under a water park. That's what's left of Caiaphas and his sons. He's the guy who enjoyed his wealth, his power. He looked good outwardly. He even had a physical, face-to-face, multiple encounters with the God embodying all truth. And he's dead and had a decision to make. And he made the wrong decision. He's the one who thinks his goodness comes from, or his salvation comes from his goodness. But he had no personal faith in Jesus. Lastly, and this is where we end. Lastly, Historical figure in this is a guy named Barabbas. He's a murderer, a thief, a rebel, and a terrorist. If you look at all the different gospel accounts, if anyone could say, and don't miss this, if anyone could say that Jesus literally died for me, it was Barabbas. Most scholars believe that there is 3 crosses that were ready. We know there's 3 crosses because there was one ready for Jesus. 2 criminals dying because of what they did. 3rd cross, almost guaranteed. You're involved with killing somebody in a rebellion, Rome takes that seriously. Almost guaranteed. That middle cross was to pay a lesson to Barabbas, lest anyone try to come against Rome. And so here he is. He wakes up that morning, early in the morning. Today is my last day on this planet because of the sins I've done. And miraculously, he's released, and Jesus takes his place. I don't know if that gives you Jesus bumps at all. Here's the thing about Barabbas. I searched everywhere for information on Barabbas. There's a legend. There's stories that have been woven up. There's no fact. We really know nothing about this man, Barabbas, except for who he was, a sinner, the effect of a fallen world. But we also know something. I can't imagine for a moment that this guy didn't go, I should be dead. I should be dying today, and a really, really bad death. I know what it's like. And I'm going to follow and see what happens to this guy. And as Jesus, the Son of God, is on that cross, Barabbas, the son of the small f father, is standing there going, I have to come to grips that that's me. There's a hymn that we always sing, and it says, it was my sin that hung him there. And in a very real way, every one of us, because of sin entering the world, we're all, look, we all know what bunch of boneheads we are, the things that we do and that we're sinners. And so in a very real way, it was our sin that put Jesus on the cross. And so you look at a guy named Barabbas, and here's why I believe personally that we don't know what happened to him and that no one knows. You think this would be a story people would want to tell. Why? Because it's your story. It's my story. Because I am Barabbas. I have a decision to make regarding Jesus, the Son of God, and the truth that he embodies. I'm going to invite the worship team to come up, and we're going to sing the very much Christmas song called Amazing Grace. The reality of it all is that all of us have a choice to make, because 2,000 years ago, Jesus hung on a cross, but he was born to reveal the truth that he is the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one comes to the Father except for him, through him. He actually says a couple chapters before this that if you know the truth will set you free. Every one of us fall into one of these camps. You're either Pilate, and you were dragged here this morning, or because it's Christmas, it's a good thing to happen to do. Hey, I'm going to go do my duty. I'm living in my life. I'm powerful. I've got everything I want. Typical American Christianity, maybe. I have no need to deal with Jesus. Well, it's false. You have to deal with Jesus. You can never stand before your Creator, because death is the destiny of all men. The living should take it to heart. Maybe it's the church. It's a great place for people who have done their religious duty. And hey, I'm a good person. I've helped people. I've done all these things. Well, guess what? There is only one thing that the Bible says that allows you eternal life, to accept the truth. And here's the truth. The truth is that you could do nothing to earn your salvation. The reason that God chose faith as a representation of the heart is because it's the glue that holds you to Jesus. It means you can do nothing to partake. You cannot stand back and say, look what I earned. The only thing that we can do is glue ourselves to the work of Jesus. To stand before God Almighty and say, I don't deserve this. It's because of the work of Jesus Christ. So don't miss the significance of this day. Almost 2,000 years ago, Jesus was born for this reason, that you and I might know the truth and that the truth might set us free. Now I recognize if you're here at 11 a.m. and not 5:30 and 7:30, there's probably an understanding of who Jesus is. But I made the offer this morning and people raised their hand. if you don't know Jesus. If you've put off making a decision about Jesus, or you think your goodness is earned by the things that you've done, the representation of all my sacrifices, well, then it's wrong. It's not magic words, it's believing. Romans 10 tells us clearly, if you confess with your mouth and believe with your heart, you will be saved. Again, not magic words, it's turning my life over and saying, I'm unwilling, unable, pardon me, to save myself. Jesus, you went to a cross on Calvary to pay my debt burden. You lived a perfect life, and you paid that. You were my Passover lamb. That's the significance of Christmas. Not that God was born so much, but that God was born to reveal the truth and die. And if you've never given your life to Jesus, today is the day. Let's all stand as we sing Amazing Grace. Scriptures tell us that the enemy of our souls is the father of all lies, and he'll do everything from keeping us from coming to the truth.